Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Imagine a world where the money in your pocket, the savings you've worked so hard for, suddenly starts to lose its value. Where a simple loaf of bread could double in price in just a year, and your paycheck just can't keep up with rent. What if one major decision by a US president completely changed the global financial system forever? This isn't just about a market crash. It's the story of a slow-burning collapse, a decade-long unraveling of trust in the very dollar itself. This is the great inflation of the 1970s, when money lost its anchor and the world's most powerful economy started to drown in its own paper. How did this even happen? How could the richest nation on earth lose control of its own currency? And the big question, could it happen again? Let's set the stage. The 1950s and early 60s were a truly golden era for America. Factories were humming, wages were growing, and the middle class was booming. And at the heart of it all was a quiet, yet powerful, promise. The dollar was as good as gold. Since 1944, under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar had been the world's financial anchor. Every major currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was directly convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This simple link created immense global stability. It told investors, nations, and everyday people, this paper in your hand represents something real, something tangible. But even beneath this seemingly unbreakable stability, subtle cracks were beginning to form. By the mid-1960s, America found itself fighting two massive battles, one abroad in Vietnam, and another at home with President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs aimed at alleviating poverty. LBJ wanted to fund both ambitious initiatives, but without raising taxes. Instead of making tough, potentially unpopular fiscal choices, the government opted to print more money and increase borrowing. At first, the resulting inflation seemed manageable, just a few percent each year. But smart economists and foreign leaders started noticing a worrying trend. The US was sending far more dollars overseas than it had gold reserves to back them. Foreign nations, notably France, under Charles de Gaulle, began to ask, if the dollar is backed by gold, why can't we just take the gold instead? And that's exactly what they started to do. Countries began demanding their gold in exchange for dollars, rapidly draining US reserves. By the late 1960s, America's gold stockpile was dangerously low, and confidence in the dollar was evaporating. The world was slowly realizing the emperor's money had no clothes. Then, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would forever change the global economy. In a nationally televised address, he announced what became known as the Nixon shock. He declared that he had directed his Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, we might ask. That temporary suspension would never be lifted. For the very first time in modern history, the US dollar, and with it, virtually every currency on Earth, was no longer tied to anything real, any physical asset. Money became purely fiat currency, backed only by trust in governments and central banks. Initially, this felt liberating to some. Without the gold constraint, governments could spend more freely, stimulate growth, and manage recessions with greater flexibility. But freedom without discipline often leads to danger. And within just a few years, America learned that harsh lesson firsthand. The 1970s started with a sense of optimism. There was low unemployment, strong consumer demand, and easy credit. But then, the infamous oil shocks hit. In 1973, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, declared an oil embargo against the US overnight. Oil prices quadrupled. Gas stations ran dry, and lines of cars stretched for blocks as people frantically tried to fill their tanks. Inflation surged into double digits, and because energy touches literally everything, transport, food, production, manufacturing prices across the board spiraled upwards. But here's the crucial twist. It wasn't just about oil. It was also about psychology. Once people began to expect prices to rise continually, they started demanding higher wages to cope. Businesses, in turn, raised their prices to cover those increased wage costs. This self-fulfilling prophecy, this wage price spiral, became a monster that the Federal Reserve seemed powerless to stop. Meanwhile, politicians often made things worse. To fight unemployment, they'd print more money. To try and control prices, they'd impose price freezes. Neither strategy truly worked. By 1975, inflation hit a staggering 12%, and the public lost almost all faith in the dollar. Their savings were being quietly, but effectively, destroyed. The government's response to this crisis seemed increasingly desperate. President Gerald Ford launched a public campaign called Whip Inflation Now or Win. He urged Americans to spend less, save more, and even wear little red win buttons. It was, frankly, a bit of a joke. Inflation doesn't stop because you tell people to stop spending. It stops when the money supply is responsibly controlled. But the Federal Reserve was hesitant to act aggressively. Every time they tried to raise interest rates to combat inflation, unemployment would surge. Every time they backed off, prices would soar again. The 1970s became a frustrating tug-of-war between economic growth and stability. And unfortunately, both sides seemed to be losing. Then came 1979. Inflation rocketed to 13%. Mortgage rates neared an unbelievable 20%. And America's financial credibility was collapsing. The dollar was in freefall. That's when one determined man stepped in and changed monetary policy forever. His name was Paul Volcker, the newly appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was tall, blunt, and had absolutely no interest in playing politics. He firmly believed that inflation was a moral issue, that destroying the savings of ordinary people was nothing less than an act of national betrayal. His solution, pain. He made the incredibly difficult decision to raise interest rates higher than anyone thought possible. And then he kept them there, despite immense pressure. The immediate result was brutal. The U.S. plunged into a deep recession. Unemployment soared to 10%. Farmers protested in Washington, driving their tractors around the Fed building in frustration. But slowly, gradually, inflation began to break. By 1983, after years of tight money policies and deep economic hardship, inflation finally fell back below 4%. Volcker's shock therapy worked, but at an enormous cost. Factories closed, national debt soared, and millions lost their jobs. Yet, America's financial credibility was eventually restored. Money had regained its anchor, not gold this time, but the discipline of sound monetary policy. The Great Inflation didn't just change prices, it fundamentally changed the entire financial world. Before the 1970s, finance was relatively stable, predictable, almost boring. After it became, in many ways, a casino. Without the gold limits, credit expanded almost endlessly. Banks innovated with new instruments, derivatives, complex debt products, and speculative investments. The stock market began its long ascent. The age of financialization, as we know it today, had truly begun. And that's the strange paradox of the 1970s. The decade that so profoundly destroyed trust in money also inadvertently created the blueprint for much of the modern economy we live in today. But that trust, it was rebuilt on confidence alone, not on something tangible. And confidence, well, confidence is inherently fragile. Fast forward to today, in 2008, after the global financial crisis, central banks worldwide printed trillions to stabilize markets. Then, in 2020, during the pandemic, they printed even more, faster than at any other time in history, and once again, inflation returned. By 2022, U.S. inflation hit 9.1%, the highest it had been since, you guessed it, the 1970s. Food, fuel, rent, all climbing faster than wages. Economists began whispering that same old, unsettling question. Have we learned nothing from the past? Because when money becomes too easy, too plentiful, it inevitably starts to lose its meaning. And when that fundamental trust is broken, history doesn't just rhyme. It often repeats itself. The Great Inflation was supposed to teach the world an unforgettable lesson, but lessons, sadly, often fade. When memories do. So, what can we truly learn from the Great Inflation of the 1970s that's still relevant today? Lesson 1. Money needs discipline. When printing money becomes an easier choice than making tough fiscal decisions. The value of that money inevitably erodes. First, silently, then suddenly and brutally. Lesson 2. Expectations shape reality. Once people genuinely believe that prices will continue to rise, their collective behavior almost guarantees it. Inflation isn't just a set of economic numbers. It's also deeply rooted in human psychology. Lesson 3. Stability is incredibly fragile. Every financial system, at its core, rests on public trust. And once that trust begins to crack, even the strongest, most prosperous economy can quickly descend into chaos. The 1970s taught America how quickly stability can vanish and how painstakingly difficult it is to rebuild. Today, as governments around the world grapple with rising national debts, intense political pressures, and a new era of global uncertainty, one crucial question continues to linger. If money lost its anchor once before, what happens if it slips again? Because, as history often reminds us, every empire eventually ends the same way, not necessarily with invasion, but with inflation. If you've found this deep dive into history and economics insightful, please do give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to bring more untold financial mysteries to light. And make sure to subscribe to Shadows of History for more stories where history, money, and power collide. Because the past doesn't just live in dusty books, it lives, in many ways, right in your wallet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.